Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of Cybernetics and Psychology and Sellars' Scientific Image of the Mind. The long-neglected Wilfrid Sellars has been rediscovered thanks to the warm reception that his epigones, especially Robert Brandom and John McDowell, have received in both analytic and continental philosophical audiences. Yet the recent Sellars Renaissance neglects depth to the sciences of the mental in the 1940s through the 1960s. Without an appreciation of his side of Sellars' thought, we run the risk of misinterpreting his famous ideas, such as what he called the myth of the given. The sciences of the mental that influenced Sellars were cybernetics and behaviorism, both of which need to be rescued from obscurity of their own. In cybernetics, the nascent science of information theory developed by Norbert Wiener and others, Sellars found the concept of a feedback loop. In behaviorism, especially the version developed by Brandom, a positive role is found for cognition, the explanation of behavior. The cognitive behaviorist Tolman and the cybernetician Norbert Wiener were drawing deep on influences in American pragmatism. Cognition and action cannot be theorized independently. These influences gave Sellars a theoretically important point of departure for his vision of his father, the critical realist Roy Wood Sellars, as well as Wittgenstein. In this seminar, we will examine how Sellars drew upon cognitive behaviorism and cybernetics to carry out his grand plan of, quote, naturalizing idealism, or how to place the crucial philosophical insights of Kant and Hegel on the gold standard of empirical scientific inquiry. We'll examine how Sellars' use of examples such as guided missiles and robots opened up a space of philosophical speculation that resonates with recent developments in enactive cognitive science, ecological psychology, and the new rationalism of Brassier and Negarestani. I think, Carl, you can take it away.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully I will live up to some of that hype. We'll see how much. So what I've prepared, here's what I envision for how this will proceed. For the course, there are quite a few people enrolled, and it's a one-credit class. So I think my understanding with Vincent is that we will not be requiring presentations. So for those of you who've had New Center classes before, and that's an expectation you've had, I think we're not going to deal with that expectation. There will be a final paper / project that will be due. I believe the deadline is 2 weeks after the end of the seminar. So 2 weeks after the end of the seminar, so that would put us at June 19th as the deadline. So what I have prepared a Google Doc, which I'm going to put, see here, I'm going to put this for all panelists and attendees. I think I want that. And I will also share my screen, so you have both options. So the plan for the course, so I'm sort of go over the plan for the course, how this will work, discuss some preliminary questions, and then get into some of the specifics. I think probably I'll want to do this for at least maybe, I'm thinking maybe half an hour to an hour. Then we can do a break. When we return, I'll get to know I'd like to get to know some of you a bit better. I know some of you by name. I don't believe I've met from social media, from Twitter and from Facebook. But I'd like to get to know, who you are and see what we can do together. So plan for the day is sort of get into the details, and of course, by all means, at any point, feel free to ask a question in the chat or to voice it out loud. So in terms of the logistics, So as I believe I've mentioned to a few of you, but I want to begin with a confession that this is my first graduate seminar that I am teaching. And the last time I was taught, I have taken graduate seminars, but that was 15 years ago at a time when I was a full-time student. So I am, if you feel that my expectations are either too demanding or not demanding enough, because I am used to teaching, I'm used to teaching 19 and 20-year-olds who are overworked and stressed and bored and distracted all the time. So if you feel as if I am pitching this at a level that is too elementary, please let me know. And of course, if I'm also demanding too much from you, please let me know that as well. So my plan is to each week have a main text and supplemental texts. And I should indicate those more carefully in the readings on the Google Drive. So I think what I'll do, and I'll go back in and for each week, break it up into main text and supplemental texts. So the main texts are the ones that I want us to focus on, and the supplemental texts are texts that I think are extremely helpful and important. But you know, if you have to prioritize, then that'd be my suggestion how you prioritize. I understand there's going to be an online discussion group, is that right? On Slack, is that correct?
Yes, and I know, I think it's Discord.
Oh, Discord, okay. And we're also using Google Classroom?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So I mean, I'm fairly online myself these days, and so I think those will give plenty of opportunities for us to interact after classes and between classes. I am more than happy, and I think we will have some discussion later on today, probably after our break around 1 o'clock. In terms of the assessment, I'm thinking of a 10 to 15 page paper. That would be between 15,000 and between 50,000 and 2,000 words. But I know many of you are in programs outside of philosophy. And so I'm perfectly happy to discuss with you what might be a discipline appropriate final project rather than a traditional philosophy paper. Okay. Is everything okay about everything? Any questions or concerns about any of these basic logistics? Okay. So here's some preliminary, getting down into the meat of it then. Here are then some preliminary questions that I would like to put on the table. Right, as the course description suggests, I'm making this claim that cybernetics and behavioristic psychology were very important for Sellars, and that are actually part of his enduring contemporary legacy. And those are very big claims, and I shall do what I can to convince you, if not of their truth, at least of their plausibility. And I think it's the contemporary relevance that's sort of the harder sell here, right? Because to say that behaviorism and cybernetics were important for Sellars is, I think, a relatively easy presentation be made along those lines. In particular, the behaviorism, crucial for the text language, rules, and behavior, which we're looking at today, and cybernetics, important for the text being and being known, which will be our main text for next week. But there's also room for skepticism, I think, that about what would be the contemporary relevance of this, right? You might think, well, after all, one might think, well, behaviorism, well, I mean, that's passe, right? We had a cognitive revolution. You know, we're not behaviorists anymore. And if Sellers's philosophy depends upon his behaviorism, then so much the worse for his philosophy as a whole. Now, there certainly are many Sellars-inspired philosophers who want to sever some of his philosophical claims from what I take to be their behavioristic foundation. But I am increasingly skeptical as to whether that is whether that does such that does a kind of hermeneutic injustice to Sellars, to try and sort of cleave some of his semantical or epistemological claims away from how he used behaviorism to get those claims off the ground. But I also am inclined to think myself that behaviorism, or at least Sellers's version of behaviorism, is not passé, but rather that we can discern close relatives of Sellers's behaviorism and his cybernetics in what is now called sort of the 4E cognitive science: cognition as embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended. And so then that's sort of, that's not to say that Sellars aligns in a very neat, obvious way with 4E cognition, but rather to say that there's a kind of interesting historical story I want to be able to trace that shows how the cybernetics and behaviorism that Sellars thought was the cutting edge science of his time, and which on my reading is quite foundational for his philosophical claims, is has its own contemporary echoes. And so there might be sort of ways in which some of the 4E cognitive science can be put into a productive conversation with the Sellarsian legacy. And I think it's going to be important in order to see that there's a contemporary version of Sellars which we can get at without doing terrible injustice to the conceptual integrity of the system, and without just sort of saying, well, it's all just passé. Okay, so I want to say a little bit now about this contrast between left and right Sellarsians, a contrast that may be familiar to at least a few of you. And if it's not familiar to any of you, that's okay. I'll just try and we can get into details if you wish. But I want to present this in part because of how it's part of the story of how I came to Sellars and how I'm reading Sellars. So, right, Wilfrid Sellars it has a very complicated legacy, in part because I think because of the diversity of influences that he is drawing upon. Sellars himself was drawing upon pragmatism and Wittgenstein and logical positivism and other strands of American philosophy outside of pragmatism. And he is trying, and of course he's reasonably informed with the sciences of his own day. And so he's trying to synthesize all this into some kind of system, or at least to think systematically, if not to think a system. And of course, with so many different dispersed influences, seeing how it all holds together will be a challenge. And what seems to have happened with Sellers's legacy is many philosophers want to take up some parts of it and leave other parts of it behind. And this has generated a distinction initially made famous by Richard Rorty between left and right Sellarsians, his own riff on left and right Hegelians. So the left Sellarsians would be those who emphasize that there is something sui generis about the space of reasons, that when we are asserting, judging, evaluating, criticizing, revising, we are engaged in a kind of activity that is irreducible to any other way of characterizing it. So the normative is irreducible to the natural. And that's a claim that has received a great deal of uptake among particular philosophers of the Pittsburgh School. So, particularly Robert Brandom and John McDowell, as well as philosophers who they influenced, who they trained. And so we can also mention Quil Kukla, Lynn Terrell, Mark Lance, Jeremy Koons, Michael Wolff, many others who are sort of engaged in this project of trying to sort of explicate this normative dimension of human thought as something that is irreducible to any kind of naturalistic, cognitive scientific, psychological kind of story. But at the same time, you also have the right Sellarsians who are inclined to deny exactly that thesis. Right, these are the Sellarsians who take up Sellars's claim that in the dimension of description and explanation, science is the measure of all things. And importantly for these philosophers, they take up with Sellars's interest in the scientific, to quote Sellars, the scientific image of man, or what I'm trying to use in less gendered language, the scientific image of mind. That's to say, what do the sciences tell us about ourselves? What does we've inherited this sort of philosophical, these very heady philosophical claims from the tradition about mind and meaning and morality and modality and mathematics. But how do we connect those with any kind of plausibly naturalistic story about the fact that human beings are a particular kind of animal that has been shaped by evolutionary pressures, and we have to be sort of somehow understand how these are connected. And scientific realism of this sort has then, if you've this strand of Sellars that's been taken up by Paul Churchland, Ruth Millikan, Daniel Dennett, and others, you find a lot of pressure against taking folk psychology seriously. One can, Dennett, for example, is very skeptical about direct realism, very skeptical about the intentional stance as having any kind of indefeasible authority. Churchland, of course, is most famous for how he's relentlessly he's pushed a limitivism about propositional attitudes, a cause that's been recently taken up by Alex Rosenberg. And so you have these sort of different strands of the Sellarsian legacy, where some people are emphasizing what Sellars says about the irreducibility of the normative, and other philosophers are saying, well, we're just critters with evolved brains, and we just got to think, have that be our starting point for philosophical reflections. So and I've given you this overview in order to briefly as a sort of advertisement for my own view, which is that we want to get beyond, or at least I want to get beyond this left versus right distinction. This is the only sense in which I am a centrist is in the sense of being a centrist Sellarsian. And I want to try and find, so my project is the search for the unity in diversity, what holds the whole thing together. And so my guiding thread here is the idea that Sellars is, in some sense, Of course, in some sense, there's always a ticking bomb. In some sense, he's a Kantian naturalist. That's to say, in some sense, he wants to naturalize Kant. Now, of course, that raises all sorts of questions. What does that even mean? And why would anybody even want to do that? So as a preliminary, at a minimum, naturalizing Kant, I think, would have to mean rejecting the transcendental ideality of space and time as usually understood. And I say that because what naturalizing Kant is going to involve, in some sense, saying, well, Kant was onto something really important in the first critique, when he describes sensibility and the understanding as somehow distinct but cooperating, and that he was onto something and how he thought about, how concepts work and the role of concepts in experience. So there's a lot of Kantian themes that are very important, but the naturalist will want to say, we need to be able to understand this whole story as a story about the conceptual structures that evolved over time in a particular lineage of terrestrial animals. And so it will then have to be the case that we have to then, in some sense, be, to use the Kantian term, transcendental realists about space and time. Space and time existed in the full-blown, metaphysically robust sense of existed prior to the emergence of animals that have minds like ours. And then, of course, one big question is going to be, well, if you remove the transcendental ideality of space and time from the Kantian picture, are you sure it doesn't all just fall down? And that's a big question that I think Sellars wrestles with tremendously, and perhaps succeeds, perhaps not. I think there's also then this big question that needs to be addressed. Why would anybody even want to naturalize Kant? Like, why would you want to try even do that? And I think the answer there is, well, because there are really compelling reasons for thinking that naturalism is true. And there are compelling reasons for thinking that Kant's epistemology and philosophy of mind are compelling. And just given these two so we can sort of look at what the arguments might be on either for both of those claims, but it's in light of the idea that those are both true in some sense. Well, you just want to minimize the incompatibility between them. So what I want to do now is propose a weak claim and a strong claim. And the weak claim, I think, I can easily convince you of in our time together. The weak claim is, right, we should approach Sellars, we should try and read Sellars as with this idea that he was attempting to naturalize Kant, and that if we read that as his project, we will be in a better position to understand why he says what he does, and sort of try and see better how it all hangs together. That's the weak claim. And I think I probably can convince many of you, or at least maybe some of you, by that weak claim in our 4 weeks together. The stronger claim, which I doubt I could convince you of, and in fact I am even not entirely sure about this myself, but it's a claim that I think is at least worth presenting. I believe this half the time. And that Sellars not only attempted to naturalize Kant, but in fact, to an extent that has not been recognized, succeeded in doing so. That's a much stronger, much more provocative claim. And like I said, I believe that claim about half the time. Other times, I'm not so sure. All right. I've been talking for about what? It feels like half an hour. Maybe it's been longer. Should I pause for a moment and give you a chance to ask questions or propose comments?
No, I was just going to say very good summary of Sellars and his legacy and everything so far. There's been a lot of times where I've wanted to interject and comment about things, but I'm restraining myself. But
well, by all means contribute if you wish.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, sorry, I'm very excited. You know, I'm writing my master's thesis on Sellars right now, and so like a lot of this stuff is like really pertinent to me. But I think I'll save it for later because there's a lot of specific questions I'd like to ask you. I wouldn't want to bog down everybody else. But anyways, I agree with you basically with your centrist Sellarsianism. That's what I was going to say. That's what basically I'm arguing in my thesis, is because basically my thesis is about this division in pragmatism right now between experiential and linguistic pragmatists.
Mm-hmm.
So you have Brandom and Rorty on the linguistic side, or what's sometimes called neo-pragmatism. And then the people who adhere to more classical pragmatist view, they call themselves nowadays experiential pragmatists. And
Mm-hmm.
basically what I'm trying to argue is in the paper is that Sellars's position, read not as a left Sellarsian or right Sellarsian, but just kind of on his own terms in a so-called centrist Sellarsianism, can overcome the division between linguistic and experiential pragmatists. It's just, unfortunately, the problem is that both my advisors are hardcore Deweyians,
Mm-hmm.
and I try to argue in the paper that Dewey's theory of experience succumbs to the myth of the given, and they will not have it. And it's been a pain in the butt for the past 2 weeks trying to convince them that Dewey does indeed fall under the myth of the given. But anyways, sorry.
Yeah. Or I mean, we might talk. We can. It sounds interesting, and we certainly talk about this. I encourage the project. I certainly have thoughts about it, but like as you said, I don't want to necessarily bog down the entire class with it. But it sounds interesting. We can talk about this later on if you want.
Okay, yeah, I would love that. Yeah, because I'd like to get you, if you've engaged with Dewey in any way. I would like to hear what your thoughts on my position, because I really need help. I really need to get. I really need help. Anyways, sorry, enough of my problems.
So I know Dewey's work pretty well. I've not published on Dewey, but I actually got involved. I actually got into Sellars by way of Dewey, through a somewhat circuitous route. So I'm not published on Dewey myself, but I've read a fair amount, and I certainly have thoughts about it. But we can talk.
Okay.
Okay. Great. Anybody else have anything that they'd like to share before we move on to talking about the main text for today?
Can I jump in with a question real quick?
Please.
It always seemed to me that the right-wing Sellarsians kind of undermine the manifest image in a way, and that's their problem. But the left-wing Sellarsians don't take the normativity and the intentionality part of the manifest image seriously. Is this a fair way of characterizing the left versus right debate?
Yes, I would say so. I think that's right. Yeah. Yeah. I think it also speaks to the difficulty that Sellars himself is going to have, right? Like if he wants to, this is sort of why the tension exists, right? If you're going to endorse a kind of scientific realism that undermines sort of the confidence that like there are perceptual objects, there really are things that I perceive, like in the world that have colors and shapes and so on. If you're sort of going to undermine that kind of Aristotelian naivete about right, the proper and common sensibles, well, what's going to stop the acid of scientific realism from eating away at the entire thing to the point that you've just given up on normativity? And I think that's exactly the problem. And you can see, well, that's why we have Churchland at one extreme and McDowell at the other. And so then if Sellars is going to somehow be in between, right, we're going to want a really good story about how he's entitled to be. Is there anything? I see that there's some things in the chat. Anything come up here that we need to anything in the chat that I need to address? No? Okay. Okay, let's see here. In that case, shall I move on to discussing language, rules, and behavior? Okay. Okay. So language, rules, and behavior has this which is as interesting and somewhat complicated place within Sellars' intellectual development. It was written in 1949, both 1950, and of course this will be of interest to some of you, published in a collection honoring John Dewey, edited by Sidney Hook. It was called John Dewey, was it Philosopher of Science and Freedom, I think was the title of the collection. For those interested in the history of American philosophy, I might also draw your attention to the fact that this is the same volume in which appeared Morton White's essay, The Analytic and the Synthetic, an untenable dichotomy, an essay that then went on to become rather influential when its core claims were then advertised in a very flashy way by Quine in Two Dogmas of Empiricism. So in the history of Sellars' own thought, this essay occupies this sort of interesting transitional moment between Sellars' sort of earliest publications, which are sort of when it's published and it was very much in the area of sort of neo-Carnapian philosophy of language, in a project that Sellars called Pure Pragmatics, where he's trying to sort of just do for the pragmatics something similar to what Carnap did for syntax and logical syntax of language. But then Sellars eventually abandons this project, and abandons it rather soon after really getting into it. And he gets a much deeper engagement with normativity in a more sort of less formal way. And for this moment of Sellars' thought, there's a book by Peter Olin, Wilfrid Sellars and the Foundations of Normativity, that is truly outstanding. So what is happening in this text, Language, Rules, and Behavior? Well, Sellars tells us that a central part of the claim is investigation of what he calls a psychology of the higher processes. And that's sort of what the sort of initially claim is. That's what we're going to be getting. And one might question, well, why exactly do we need that? Like, why? What's this going to do for us philosophically? And I think the answer becomes very clear when you compare this text with an earlier text, a text that Sellars wrote, unpublished text from Sellars as a preliminary to this one. This is an unpublished text that appears in the appendix to Olin's book. And it is an article, a short draft, simply with the title Psychologism, which is a very provocative and interesting title. Because I think it becomes clear from this text, it's worth pointing out many interesting references to Dewey, both explicit and implicit references. And I take it from what this text tells us. We need a psychology of the higher processes because one of the big questions for naturalists and pragmatists is well, what exactly do we need epistemology for? Right, and in particular, if you, read, for example, major work, John Dewey, for example, was famously somewhat dismissive of epistemology. I believe at one point calling it intellectual lockjaw. Right, it's very dismissive of the kind of neo-Kantian epistemology that was prevalent at that time. And his work, Logic, Theory of Inquiry, which might look like epistemology in some ways, but also not in others, because it is not a priori, right? What Dewey is giving us is, it's a kind of, to put it in Kantian terms, Dewey's claims are synthetic a posteriori, right? Dewey is just saying, like, here are some ways in which animals have been trying to encounter and solve problems, and here are some ways in which human beings have been, some techniques human beings have invented over the millennia for doing that better, and here's how they work, and we can sort of understand a lot of philosophical issues in those terms. And given that, so then there's this question, well, okay, are we just going to become Deweyans and just replace epistemology with something like psychology? Or how are we going to retain in any sense, or can we retain in any sense, this idea that there is an a priori element in epistemology, and is that a priori element that distinguishes epistemology from psychology? The a priori element that allows us to say, as Frege, for example, would want to, that, well, psychology wants to study how thoughts occur, but psychology cannot tell us what makes an inference valid, or the goodness of inference, or as I guess the sort of standard story goes, psychology tells us how we do think, and logic tells us how we should think. Well, okay, and that shouldness, that normative kernel, is very important for Sellars. Then the question is, well, how to make sense, how to vindicate this. And I think very important for Sellars, even early on, this phase in his life, this big question of how can we, be sort of good pragmatist naturalists with Dewey, but also somehow retain this emphasis that there is something distinct about epistemology that's not reducible to psychology. So he has this sort of this anti-psychologism that he has inherited from Frege and Husserl and to some extent Carnap. So how are we going to sort of holding these together, right? That of the pragmatism and the anti-psychologism, how to hold those together? That's the agenda, I think, of this text, as well as a theme throughout much of Sellars's work. And then the role of this particular text is to say, well, we would need a psychology of the higher processes, or at least a sketch of one, in order to then understand why there would be any need at all for an a priori element of epistemology. Right? Because if you contrast epistemology with the parts of psychology that we share with other animals, well, it becomes very easy to see, well, we need epistemology to do all those things that make human cognition distinct. But if you had a psychology of, an empirical science of, what makes human cognition distinct, it would then really sharpen the force of the question, what do we need epistemology for? Okay, so given that way of setting up the project of language-less behavior, I now want to turn to a few other important notions by context and background. The first being the role of behaviorism in language-less behavior, right? The B in LRB, which Sellars calls in this text tied behavior, sort of the ways in which animals are responsive to their environments. They're embedded in their environments. They are responding to their environments. And there is an interesting tension within this text that I think Sellars was probably not fully aware of, but I think it sort of is worth pulling on a little bit. Because Sellars read very widely, and I think that in some respects, you know, Sellars wants everyone to be his friend. He doesn't always notice that he sometimes has to he's putting the same container very different views, because he does in this text reference the idea of a cognitive map. And this is why I had a supplemental text for today, Cognitive Maps in Rats and Men by Edward Tolman. So Edward Tolman was a, in some loose sense, a behaviorist psychologist, quite influential in the mid part of the 20th century. But he was not a simplistic Watsonian behaviorist. He wasn't interested in sort of simple stimulus-response connections. He lampooned that view as muscle twitchism. And Tolman is actually part of this sort of interesting sort of William Jamesian tradition of American psychology, as mediated by Tolman's teachers Edwin Holt and Ralph Barton Perry, who were, you know, building on James's legacy from principles of psychology, and, you know, in many respects, thinking about, you know, they were, in some sense, they were realists about cognition. They were not taking this very hard view, oh, cognition, mental processes, well, we can't observe them, so we can't talk about them. They were not taking that hard view, that hard line. Instead, Holt and Perry and Tolman thought that we can't afford to give up on cognition as a concept. The question is how to make it scientifically respectable. So in that sense, they are predating the cognitive revolution. In that sense, by 2 generations. As seen in context, the cognitive revolution in the 1960s is much more, not so much about reason about cognition per se, but rather about using computation as a way of thinking about what cognition is. And that's where the cybernetics legacy becomes very important. So Tolman, particularly in his work, but particularly in this text from 1948, advances a view that has been that can be called, it's not Tolman's own term, but I think it's a good way of characterizing Tolman's project, cognitive behaviorism. So against the simplistic SR view, although Tolman was willing to recognize that something like that might be true at the neuronal level, right? So he was not entirely, he was interested in sort of the idea that, well, in some sense, the stimulus response might have something to do about how neurons get connected. And Donald Hebb developed that idea, was sort of interested in Tolman. There's a lot of back and forth between them. But Tolman thought that regardless of what happens at the neuronal level, when you're talking about the whole animal, and the whole animal as a unified living sort of organized structure that is purposively and intelligently dealing with and responding to its environment, we need to not be simplistic SR behaviorists in the Watsonian tradition, but rather we have to understand that the animal is actively constructing a map-like model, or to use the contemporary term, a representation of its environment. And that representation then determines, or at least constrains, what the animal can perceive, what it will notice or attend to, as well as how it will engage with the environment in order to satisfy its needs. Now, there is an interesting question in the literature, and sort of literature about Tolman, about whether Tolman was a realist about cognition. And there actually is sort of a bit of a debate among historians of science about whether Tolman was a realist about cognition, or whether he was about these cognitions, did they really exist, or was he kind of just an instrumentalist about them? Well, we postulate them, we can talk about them as if they exist, but since we don't really observe them, they have this kind of second-rate status in our scientific theorizing. There is a debate about Tolman along those lines. I think it's quite interesting myself. I don't think it matters too much for Sellars how we resolve that debate about Tolman, in part because Sellars has his own reasons for being a scientific realist, which means that Sellars has his own reasons, independent of Tolman, for being a realist about cognitive maps. So turning then to the notion of symbolic activity, which is also the other major, oh yeah, Aaron?
Yeah, just a quick one, because I'm not sure I actually understand the distinction there of what that question would mean, of whether these cognitive maps are real. Right. I guess the only way I can conceptualize it is are they real rather than just kind of functional patterns or constraints of the animal's behavior? Can it be taken as a separate object? Like it's asking, do animals have intentionality? Can they be intentionally directed toward the model as opposed to just constrained by the model, right? Or is it just?
So the question is, so there's a little, okay, so here's where things get, here's why I may have opened up a can of worms I shouldn't have by even giving you this problem. But it is kind of, it's philosophically interesting for Tolman, also has some bearing on Sellars as well. Because in the legacy of the logical positivists, there was a tremendous pressure to say, well, if you can't operationalize it, if you can't show the claim gets verified in some actual experiment or experience, then you're not, then it's just sort of a kind of fiction. And so that's then the sort of the and you know, and part of what motivated behaviorism as a turn in experimental psychology was an anxiety that mental processes simply can't be observed, so we shouldn't even introduce them in our science at all. And so in terms of how Tolman is concerned, there's this then question, well, is he turning his back on verificationism and operationalism in his methodology? Or is he going to say, well, we can talk about these things as if they exist. We can introduce them as kind of helpful sort of fictions for generating experiments.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see what the real, though. It seems similar to the way that Kant sort of proposes regulative ideals, or Kant's conception of teleology, right? It kind of goes to the other, and in the sort of Wiener, Rosenbluth, who was the other one, Bigelow article, they sort of seem to do the same sort of thing with the way that they use purposiveness. So I'm not sure what would be at stake in asking what's real. Like, is this a real mental object or just a necessary way to interpret what's going on here, other than saying, can it be second order? Right? Can it second order be an object of
I see what you're getting at. I see what you're getting at now. So what's the stake even raising the question?
Yeah, that's unless it seems the only thing that suggests to me is whether we have a naturalized version of intentionality, that the rat can think about its image, as opposed to, like, the rat both sees the maze and builds a map to navigate the maze and can navigate the map separately, intentionally, or whether for the rat there's just being in the maze, which is being in the map. And for us, we can abstract the map because we have an intentionality and the rat doesn't, or is intentionality natural, or
so I mean, I might want to not, I might not be entire. It is true. I think important for Sellars, and also just philosophically, that's true to say that part of what makes human cognition distinct is our ability to make our maps explicit and take the maps themselves as objects of cognition. But I think what's at stake in terms of whether we're going to be realists about I guess part of what's at stake, in my view, part of what's at stake is that if we simply say, well, is the rat thinking, or is it just that we as psychologists describe the rat as if it's thinking? I guess my own view, as the kind of naturalist that I aspire to be, is to say that the rat is really thinking. And I say that because if animals are not actually thinking, it's going to be much, much harder for us to tell a naturalistically plausible story about the origins of human thought. Are there any questions I'm going to share right now?
Sorry?
I think, Deschamps?
No, I'm Arman. Do you hear me? Do anybody hear me?
Yes, I do. Arman, yeah, hi.
Okay, hi. A related question about what Aaron says, question/comment. It is as if we are talking about maps, as if there are necessarily internal models that a rat or a human has in itself, or is it real, or is it real or intangible, or is it not? As if I understand, as I understand the text, where he talks about the real connection between, for example, color and extension. What he tries to say is that the connection is not, of course, the connection is between the language of rationalists, who is projecting his language into the non-linguistic world or non-linguistic reality. The problem here is this. What is real here is not anymore the reality that the rationalist is mapping. What is real, or what is rationalist that sees as the map, is the language itself. The language itself becomes the map. As for the rat, any odor, any memory or anything else in the environment can become a part of the map. So map is not necessarily something unified in one place that can be real or cannot be real. It's something as if something of a structural connection between things that an organism or an agent that has the goal or purpose sees or identifies.
Yeah, no, that's so I think that's a really nice way, I think, of pushing back on Tolman's claim, right? In fact, one might worry that Tolman makes things very easy on himself by talking about very simple, very structured environments that he's given his rats, right? And so, so I think what you want to say is, well, the map is not necessarily anything that's inside the rat's brain. The map is the structural coupling, right, between the maze and the animal, or something like that. Or maybe the map does not have these sort of nice, clear boundaries, right, because it involves the constant looping between the environment and the brain and the body. I think it's actually sort of where the cybernetics connection becomes most interesting, right? And you know, Tolman may have been somewhat aware of cybernetics, but I don't think there's probably some suggestion that there's some people suggest he was aware of cybernetics. They were active at the same time period, but no, I think that's really nice. I think that in a way, reading Tolman in a much more you can read Tolman in a much more cybernetic way than perhaps Tolman himself was wanting to be read, and then sort of make the map that sort of causally spreads in these sort of interesting ways. Yeah, I like that idea. I don't think that Tolman. I think it's a good way of criticizing Tolman. And I actually think that will be very important for as a way of criticizing Sellars, because I think Sellars does inherit a lot of sort of this internalism about cognition, and that's going to be a problem, I think, in light of more contemporary theories. That's good.
In the next paper, the being and thought, I think.
Being and being known, yeah.
Yeah, that's where these kind of embodied map becomes a really, for me, it's almost ununderstandable why he does this. I'm looking.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I think there are a lot of ways in which, from an embodied cognition standpoint, we can see Sellars as someone who gets it really close, but misses out on something really important. And that might be important for, say, how we take up his views about language, for that matter. Okay, I think, Joshua, do you have a hand?
Can you hear me?
Hi.
Yeah, hi. I just had a question regarding what you talked about in terms of meta-philosophical shift in Sellars, earlier work, epistemology and the new affairs, realism and the new affairs, from that formalism to LRB.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I read a paper by Boris Brandom in the anthology that you yourself contributed to, Sapiens and Sentience.
Right, yeah, the paraplegic and Brandom, yeah.
Yeah, Boris, he says that actually, you cannot consider Sellars' shift as some sort of meta-philosophical shift, because, he had some sort of idiosyncratic conception of formalism in his earlier work. In the sense that his formalism was just a limiting case of his broader normative functionalism in the later work. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I mean, I understand the claim. I have to go back and look at Boris's paper But I also think there's a debate between Boris and Peter Olin on this particular point.
So I was wondering, if that's correct, you could, because we are taking Reza Negarestani's course, you could claim that, even early Sellars was less of a Carnapian compared to, that even Reza wants to claim.
Right. So like if Boris is right, he was never really as Carnapian. He was never really a neo-Carnapian. Yeah. And to be honest, I'd have to look at Boris's paper again and maybe sort of, I'm in no position right now to adjudicate between Boris and Peter. Whatever that they're having a debate about the early Sellars that I'm in no position to adjudicate right now. But thank you for that. I think you're right that there is a real there's a real argument that they're having in the literature about how to interpret the early Sellars, and they're really interesting questions there. Okay. So I'd like to do is maybe say a little bit more about what Sellars says about symbolic activity, and then go on a break and then see what we can do when we return. Okay, so back then to the outline. So I've said something so far about Sellars, what the kind of behaviorism that Sellars is inheriting, but he is a psychology of the higher processes, of course. The behaviorists in Sellars's day don't have a developed psychology of the higher processes, and so this is where Sellars is then saying, okay, given the behaviorism of our psychologists, what would a psychology of the higher processes then look like? And in particular, what are we to say about symbolic activity? And so this then question, well, one of my questions is, well, what do you mean by symbolic activity? I myself suspect, although I don't yet have any hard textual evidence for this claim, that Sellars was influenced by Ernst Cassier's philosophy of symbolic forms, although an English translation of this text had not yet appeared. So there is a question that has not been adequately resolved as to whether Sellars was only going off of the English translation, Sprach und Mythos, translated by Suzanne Langer as Language and Myth, or whether Sellars had actually read some, or perhaps even all, of philosophy of symbolic forms. It's not entirely clear how you would, and then the only textual hint I can even find that might point in the direction of Cassirer is where he mentions Leibniz, Einstein, and Helmholtz as sort of the people who really pushed symbolic, or oh, come on, Sachs. Cantor. He also mentions Cantor in that passage. And I'm just sort of thinking, well, there might be an interesting connection to Cassirer in terms of what it is where Sellars is thinking about why identify those particular individuals as the people who have extended our symbolic activity. But because I think those are very Casserian kinds of examples. But that's not to say that Cassirer is the only, even the most important influence, but it's something interesting. It's a way of sort of saying, well, here's Sellars, like he has one foot in behavioristic psychology, he's another foot in a larger neo-Kantian tradition that includes Cassirer, probably in some ways includes, figures like Carnap, that he has this vision of symbolic activity, of rule-governed symbolic activity as what is distinct about human cognition. And somehow we have got to understand what makes us distinct. It's distinct in part by being, in some sense, free, not in the sense of being uncaused, as he says, but free in the sense of it's not tied. That when we are engaged in logic or physics or mathematics, we are concerned with possibility, with alternative conceptions of physical law, with alternative types of numbers, or different kinds of possibility, and that interest in possibility, that commitment to modality being very central to human cognition, makes human cognition distinct, and importantly distinct from that of other animals, right? Rats running mazes have cognitive maps, but they are not sort of in their free time conceptualizing other kinds of mazes that they could be running. So then we can, in a very loose sense, naturalize Kant, in a very sort of loose sense, combine insights from Ernst Cassirer and Edward Tolman. If we can understand our symbolic activities as a special kind of cognitive behavior, what makes it special then is the role of rules as being from mere habits. And last major point then before we adjourn, why might we want to be able to do this, Sellars says, is because this would allow us to reject, and it's an interesting phrase, the pseudo-psychology of cognitive givenness. And so at this point, something very interesting has happened, I think, in Sellars' work, where he is beginning to launch an attack on the myth of the given. And he launches the attack by saying the myth of the given is a pseudo-psychology. But I find it a very interesting, very suggestive phrase. I think on that note, I'm happy to go on a break for, I don't know, what would you like, 5-10 minutes? Any votes? 5 versus 10? 5? 5? Okay. So 5-minute break, not enough time to stretch, use the restroom. Okay. So we will assume at 1:15. Okay, I have 116. If we're ready to resume. Okay. I think it'd be nice for me to perhaps learn a bit more about you and who you are and your background in philosophy and your motivation for taking the seminar. If we could do that, I think it'd be nice. I think I know some of you through online interactions, but many of you I don't. I think most of you I do not know. Anybody like to volunteer, or should I just call on people?
Probably call us.
All right, let's call people. I'll just go from my screen. So, you pronounce your name? Is it pronounced Cairo or Kiro?
Kirill, hi.
Kiro.
Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, so my background, well, so I'm doing a PhD in human-computer interaction, focusing on data interpretation through a lens of Soviet developmental psychology. I don't actually have a background in philosophy, but I'm doing a lot of the work that I'm currently doing through, informed through Sellars and some recent Sellarians like Ray Brassier.
All right, thank you very much. Interesting. Next we have Carl Olsen.
Hello. Yeah, my name is Carl. I'm also doing a PhD in my case in geography. I mean, I suppose I'm also a discount philosopher in the sense that I'm trying to, well, think about essentially what is actually going on if someone is doing geography in terms of the map making that humans have available to them and being able to navigate the world. So I'm going back to geography's meeting with philosophy in Kant, and this is sort of the perspective I'm coming to Sellars from, and I'm dabbling a little bit and trying to understand what Sellars was talking about.
Very interesting. All right, I like that. I like that a lot. Next we have David Uriel.
Sorry, I didn't unmute. So I started out as an art student. I was working in like sculpture and film and video, but I get assigned something like Deleuzian art theory. So I end up in the library reading Deleuze. I get assigned Marxist art theory. I end up in the library reading Marx. So I'm not making much art. And I figure I'm just going to do philosophy instead. Then I'll spare you the details, but some life stuff intervened. I had to take time off of school, but now I'm going back to school in about the next 6 months or so. So I'm trying to use the new center courses to kind of prepare me to work on serious humanist inquiry. Philosophically, I'm interested mainly in Marx, but I'm also interested in Brandom and some people from the analytic tradition who are interested in like, I guess, the social domain, like Sally Haslinger and social ontologist, stuff like that. Yeah, that's it.
All right, very interesting. Thank you. Next, I'd like to hear from Mateus Ferreira.
Hi. My background is I've started somewhat studying in neurobiology, and then I changed to cognitive science and philosophy of mind. It was a gradual turn, and now I'm doing a PhD in philosophy in Rio de Janeiro under the advisorship of JP, who's also a professor here, and I'm very interested in the speculative turn in philosophers like Ray Brassier and Sellars and cognitive science. For me, that's very interesting thing to connect. So.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Let's see here. Next, I'd like to hear from Cassia.
Hi, my name is Cassia. I'm from Brazil, Rio de Janeiro also. Me and Mateus are, we are from the same university, and I'm also advised by JP. My background is in philosophy, and as an undergraduate thesis, I wrote about the Wittgensteinian concept of aesthetic appreciation. And now in a master thesis, I'm trying to sort of investigate to what extent and in what ways does conceptual engineering and Rez's conception of AGI and pedagogy can help, can be useful in tackling like entrenched systems of beliefs such as capitalism and patriarchy. And I use a lot of feminism for it too. That's basically it.
Oh, sounds fascinating. Sounds great. Okay, thank you. Next, I'd like to hear from Aladdin.
Hi. So I have a background in fine art and visual anthropology. And regarding philosophy, I don't have much background except like now about a year in and out of the new center. And I took the class because I got a bit hooked about the question of cybernetics while discovering the new center, and especially when I'm writing a kind of a script for video art about the dream of a neurobiologist, German neurobiologist that was becoming a beast during his dream. And so I got like, I think, yeah, I found some connection here, maybe to find. That's why I took the class.
Thank you. Thank you. Next, I'd like to hear from Armand.
Hi, I'm Arman from Iran. With regard to background, not much to talk about really, specifically philosophically speaking. But I write science fiction, mostly in Farsi. So, but to Sellars, I came through Kant, actually, very unusual, I know. But apparently his reading of Kant is idiosyncratic or something, and I didn't know about that. But his reading of transcendental deduction was very interesting. And so I got to read him. But before that, I read the empiricism and philosophy of mind, I think. And yeah, that was beautiful. But this class, I don't know, I mainly took because I wanted to know you actually, Mr. Sachs, but that's beautiful class. I'm happy to be here.
All right, thank you. Next, maybe Alexandra.
Hi, I go by Alex. I'm a sculptor and art fabricator. I don't really have a background in philosophy. I've picked up a couple of philosophy classes over the years, but not much else. But I'm interested in questions of cognition and representation, both in my own work and to do kind of more art historical work. So this is why I picked up the class.
Very good, thank you. Next, Aaron, please.
Hi. So yeah, my background is not really in philosophy. It's in sort of dilettantish mix of history, political science, and German literature, actually. And I'm kind of coming to it late and trying to rectify that. And yeah, I guess in terms of interest, yeah, kind of Kantian or Hegelian sort of practical philosophy, and how that could be applied to sort of politics and Marx.
Okay, very good. Okay, so some Marxists here, that's good. Next, can I hear maybe perhaps from Edna Amador?
Hi, I'm Edna. I'm from Mexico City. I'm an undergraduate student in philosophy. I run a blog about translations, and that's my way to English. I got familiar with Sellars because Daniel Dennett, because I'm very interested in apes behaviorism, so that's why I'm here.
Oh, interesting. Next, might I hear from Jordan Johnson?
Yeah, So I have something of a background in philosophy. I was an undergrad in philosophy, was very influenced by the pragmatist in my thesis on Davidson. I then left philosophy and am now a lawyer, working in international law in New York. I'm considering going back to graduate school for philosophy, law, something in between. I'm interested in the Pittsburgh School. I am also very interested in Alistair McIntyre, Charles Taylor, Michael Sandel, and philosophers of law working on respectable theoretical foundations for law that's has a substantive conception of the good life, as opposed to sort of traditional liberal frameworks. And yeah.
Very interesting, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Next, we'd like to hear from Raphael.
Okay, hi. My name is Rafael. I am from Brazil as well. I just, my background is in international relations and political theory, both my bachelor's and my master's thesis. I just defended my thesis on Marx's conception of metabolism for thinking the Anthropocene and the critique of political economy in the Anthropocene. And I, like right by the end of it, I ended up sketching a sort of reading of the early Marx through Brassier's and the whole debate around communism as the collective management of alienation. So this sort of naturally got me a little bit interested on how they were deploying Sellars. And then after I did Sassilotto's seminar as well, that I got a lot more context on that. It got me, even though I'm very out of my depth in terms of analytical philosophy, it got me very interested in particular how Sellars thinks the revisability between the manifest and the scientific image and the interaction between those two things, because I think it could have something to do with the way history attends to the revisability between the human and nature in Marx as well. So I think there is something there, but I'm not sure what exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely something there. Okay, next I'll hear from John Sosky.
Hi, I'm an addiction and recovery researcher who works at a transitions clinic with formerly incarcerated people. My PhD is actually in intellectual history, but most of the work I do right now is clinical and epidemiological. And I guess my bigger interest is in the philosophical foundations of a Marxist psychology as an empirical science. And how that brings me here is I'm very interested in what questions of psychopathology do to the sort of thinking of norm that's at the center of Sellars' project, and what happens if we reread the debates that you sketched out today through the perspection of addiction or schizophrenia or dementia as our starting point, rather than the putative norms that Sellars begins with.
Yeah, no, I think there's an interesting question here about whether there might be a kind of neuroableism in Sellars and Brandom and other people that might be very might worry about quite a bit. So I like that very much. Okay.
Also, I follow you on Twitter and enjoy your perspective.
Thank you very much. Next, Brian Kovalats. You're unmuted.
I think you're muted.
There we go.
You're unmute. Yeah. You're still muted.
Having trouble, Ryan? Okay. Can we come back to you? Okay. We'll come back to you then. Let's see here. How about John Stiver?
Hey, Carl. So I know you a little bit through Facebook, and I've been very intrigued by some of the postings and conversations. I'm quite rusty at philosophy, but I have a graduate degree in communications, culture, and technology from Georgetown. And in my thesis, the intent was to look at how to integrate and embody a public. And I kind of looked into ideas around what an embodied public might mean. And then I kind of fell upon some of the problems I think that you're talking about in terms of linguistic and other concerns for embodying a public. And I looked at various modes or methods or frameworks, including Deleuze and Guattari, rhizomatic networks, Habermas's speech community, looking at Dewey's great community and other ideas of how do you improve democracy basically in a participatory manner and make it stronger. And I think I eventually came upon the problem of cognitive bias and backstage cognition as being a problem where biases are not well known to the person involved. And I looked at some cognitive mapping theory by Mark Turner. I don't know if that's even related to this sort of cognitive mapping, but so I'm just kind of like wanting to like get my toe back in the water and understand how my thesis could be moved into something else. And what I heard Kasia mention too sounded really interesting to me about understanding how to address belief systems and ideologies and sort of deconstructing them through cognitive mapping possibly. So that's my loose way of talking about it.
Okay, thank you. Next, I hear from Ewan. Is it pronounced Ewan? Aiken?
Hi, Ivan. Yeah, it's an Irish
I'm
name.
so sorry.
Yeah, no worries. It confuses the hell out of everybody. I don't have a background in philosophy, but my background is in filmmaking. But I was raised by an engineer, so I think I'm a systems thinker by proxy. So thinking through the image, but also literature. I work as an artist and as an arts worker in the technical aspect of things. I suppose my interest is in the expanded essay film, and I'm working through collective practice at the minute and thinking through cybernetics also and Marx. And my current research is on female political prisoners from Ireland in the 1920s and in the 1980s and current ETA political prisoners.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, I hear from Eva.
Hi, I'm Eva. Can you hear me? My background is in art theory and interactive technology. So I don't have any knowledge about Sellars, but I'm really interested in systems and technology and how you interact with environments, because I build this sensor-based instruments that sense pollution in the atmosphere, and they are embodied. So I'm really interested in this cognitive and embodied, like when you walk around and you can hear the sound of the environment, and how that confuses like the mapping that you have generally. So I'm really interested in Sellars because of that.
Okay, thank you. See here, I don't think we've heard from Philippe. I don't think we've heard from you yet.
Oh, hi, Carl. Hi, everyone. I don't have any academic background whatsoever. I stopped studying 12 years ago, but I came back and I decided to do it first through the News Center. I'll get I'll get into a philosophy undergrad in September. So right now I've blown my brain into smithereens, and they're each is studying different parts of the history of philosophy. But I'm aware that we've been concentrating on philosophy of mathematics. All of this on a quite introductory level. I'm also interested in Sellars, and I like what I've read so far. I'm very interested in Marxist psychology, and I think I would like in the near future to try to develop a pedagogical philosophy program for the early infancy, in terms of trying to experiment with teaching formal languages and logic to young children, even before their native languages, so to speak. Yeah, that's it.
All right, thank you very much. Let's see here. I don't think I've heard from Alfredo Lozano yet.
Yeah, no. Hi, I am Alfredo from Mexico. I also don't have a background in philosophy. I did a bachelor's in applied mathematics and computer science. And I work developing tools of natural language processing, mostly machine learning based. And here I'm interested in cognition and world making, and how, yeah, and using this so to inform my own arts practice. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Let's see here. Brian, can we hear you now? No, we can't hear you yet. I'm sorry. That's too bad. There are several people here who don't have images up. And I know we've heard some of you, but not all of you. Is anyone here? Okay. Is it Cheyenne?
Yes, it's Cheyenne. It's a Native American name. Hi, I'm Cheyenne. I'm yeah, so like I was saying, I'm doing my master's degree on Sellars. Oh, sorry, not master's degree, master's thesis on Sellars. And I'm trying to get it done right now. It's due in a week. I'm getting my master's degree at the University of Oregon. Fortunately, it kind of ended up being kind of a crappy department for me because of the woman I wanted to work with. Her name is Rocio Samprana. Some of you may have heard of her. She wrote a book on Hegel, on the doctrine of the concept, I believe, like a year ago, or like 2 or 3 years ago. And she left for Emory, so I ended up having to like basically do this thing where I had to make a compromise and work with and write. It wasn't, Sellars wasn't a problem. I mean, I'm interested in Sellars. I'm planning to specialize in thought. I got interested in Sellars' thought through the writings of Ray Brassier, as I imagine several people here probably did at some point. And then, you know, like, so yeah, basically right now I'm on the deadline to finish that. I'm doing two things at the same time. I'm writing my master's thesis on Sellars, and I'm drafting my doctoral dissertation proposal because I'm planning to go study in the United Kingdom. And so I'm doing my doctorate. I'm planning my doctorate to be on like the study of concept of Wirklichkeit, or actuality, in Hegel's Science of Logic, specifically the second section, Lehre vom Wesen, the doctrine of essence. And how Hegel's conception of modality, how he thinks dialectically the relationship between possibility and impossibility, how we could apply that to and have it function as an alternative to the contemporary suppositions within popular forms of quantified modal logic, such as cryptosemantics, most obviously, right, which is derived from Leibnizian suppositions regarding modality. And so that's basically what my project is for my doctoral project, but that's the long term. That's assuming I can get this thesis done and get my defense approved by my hardcore Dewey and advisors, you know, so. Okay, that's I'll leave it there.
I think I'm sure I know those people. I know the Oregon department pretty well. I'm sure I know those people.
Pratt, yes, my advisor is Scott Pratt. and Mark
Oh
Johnson.
yeah, Scott. No, he's
They're good guys. They're good guys. They're the best dudes in the department, as far as I'm concerned. But it's just it wasn't pragmatism was what I really wanted to write about. You know, I was interested in Sellars more, and you know, with Dewey, it's like I told you, it's getting really rough there. But anyways, I'll leave it. I'll shut up. I talk too much. I'm like Zizek, I talk too much. So okay, keep going. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Is anyone else in the call who has not yet introduced themselves? I think I have everyone.
Yeah, I haven't, but my internet's quite bad, so I'm just going to leave my camera off if that's all right. And if I glitch out as well, yeah, sorry about that. So I'm Enda. I have a background in my undergraduate in philosophy, and I did a master's in fine art. I guess like I'm taking this class because I read a bit of Sellars, and I've read a bit of stuff around cybernetics, but I've never really read the two in connection. So I'm really interested to see what kind of a kind of direction the class is going to take, and how you're going to draw those links. I guess I have a lot of different interests. One thing that I think this might be quite relevant to is I'm thinking around the connection of conceptual reengineering to actual social practices. And again, I guess like most people thinking about that in terms of like Marxism, Marxian kind of thought. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from. Yeah, I'm a bit unwell today, so sorry, my contribution is not so good.
No, that's fine. Thank you. All right. So I'm sort of I'm interested, and I'll have to say a little bit taken aback at how many Marxist Sellarsians there are. It's amusing. I think I guess this is sort of a meeting of the Ray Brassier fan club.
Well, I was going to remark that I think there are a lot of parallels between Marx's thought and Sellars' thought. Right now, I'm doing an independent study with John Bellamy Foster, and we're talking about. I'm teaching him Sellars basically, you know, because he's interested in Sellars, and he's also a Marxist ecologist, you know, and I'm basically, you know, and he drew this intelligent parallel between what Sellars says, between like particularly like, you know, this distinction in Sellars, right, between sapiential and sentiential capacities, and signifying and picturing, and how there's a parallel between what Marx, you know, I forget what text it is, but Marx once says that, you know, what does he say? Mind is a reflection of matter, I think he says, but like mediated through language. He says something like that. And even Vladimir Lenin's work, I mean, I know controversial figure, right? But I mean, Sellars once, I said this in the chat, and Ray actually gave me the evidence for this. I can give you the link that Ray provided me. That Sellars one time when he was drunk, so maybe it wasn't, you know, maybe it's not, you know, the best thing to gauge, but he once said that empiricism in the philosophy of mind was his attempt to rewrite he said it was the analytic version of Vladimir Lenin's materialism and imperial criticism. If you're familiar with that text, you know, it's Vladimir Lenin criticizing this sort of obscure movement in late 19th, early 20th century philosophy of science called imperial criticism, most famously associated with Ernst Mach, and they got into a whole thing where they were criticizing Ludwig Boltzmann, and it's interesting, very, very interesting. So bottom line, what I'm trying to say is the Marxist Sellarsian parallel, I don't think is it makes sense. I think there's a reason why we see a lot of Marxists being drawn to Sellars because of his yeah. Sorry, I shouldn't. I'll stop.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So I'll ask Ray where he got that story from. I heard a version of that story from Mark Lantz. I don't know if Mark is also Ray's origin, but I don't know. I was inspired by that story, and then I read Lenin, and I was like, I think Sellars was just making a joke. I mean, like, in part, I can sort of see the connections, but I think it'd be hard pressed to develop that in any real care, right? Just given Lenin's polemics against what? Plekhanov, is that right? No?
And Bogdanov as well, yeah.
Yeah. So there might be something interesting. I mean, I think that what little bit I have heard of Bogdanov actually makes me think that a Sellars-Bogdanov connection might actually be more illuminating than Sellars and Lenin.
Yes, this is something that I began to like sort of one of the gateways, I would say, because there is on Bogdanov's, particularly on technology, and Bogdanov is very interested on the naturalistic origins of organization as a quality that guides human socialized labor. So while at the same time he sees those parallels between like the continuity between man and nature for him is quite clear. I mean, he's a physician as well, so like it's no surprise. But he's also interested on the things that make human be what he calls the utmost organizer in a way. So like that which has organizational capabilities that go beyond any of the other beings and so on. So like, and he links those to, I think, languages, tool making, and social organization of labor, if I'm not mistaken. Like, and this is, it's a very, I think it would be very fine with the idea of Marxism being reviewed by the sciences much more than the Leninist current would be. And I think that at least this is where I draw the possibility of a connection between them.
Interesting. Maybe we'll have to have a newsletter course on just Marx and Sellars.
It could be superb. Offer that course, please.
Yeah. I'd have to know Marx much better than I do. You know, in my background as in the States, Marx was not regarded very seriously as a philosopher. And even to this day, it's probably fair to say I know the Frankfurt School better than I know Marx himself. But it'd be a fun course to teach. So maybe it's something for us to think about for the future. Okay, so as far as we have still some time together today. Kirill, what's the name of that Backhurst book?
Oh, Soviet Revolution. Sorry, one second, I'll check. The full title is Consciousness and Revolution in Soviet Philosophy, from Bolsheviks to Valdilyankov. Yeah, so Bakhurst is McDowell's student, and I think, yeah, he gets quite a lot out of Ilyankov's reading of Lenin in terms of making connections with that kind of Pittsburgh Sellarian.
I will have to read that immediately. Yeah. I think there's this interesting. Also, I'm sort of scrolling a little bit through the chat. I do like, Philippe mentioned this sort of reason as the we that thinks through the I which speaks. And I think what part of it then gets this connection between Sellars and Marx off the ground is that both of them are right in some sense, I like using that phrase, trying to naturalize or materialize Hegel. Right? So there's a shared Hegelian influence there. But I think even then, one has to be very careful, right? In part because it's not so clear who Sellars' Hegel is or where Sellars is getting his Hegel from. Like as a reader of Hegel, I think, quite frankly, Brandom and McDowell are better readers of Hegel than Sellars himself is. Sellars' reading of Hegel is very much refracted through the British idealists, and that might pose problems. That might be something that's at least worth thinking a little bit about. But no, I think that it's nice to see some people trying to crack the work on Sellars and Marx, and I guess I'm happy to come aboard that train from the Sellars side. Okay, so we have about 40 minutes left, and I'm happy to adjourn early if you wish, but I'm also happy to perhaps dig back into the text of language, rules, and behavior. If you'd like to get more out of this. So I'm going to say the floor is open for anyone who wants to chime in with anything from this text that they'd like to talk about.
Yeah. So kind of to unpack some things from one very rich quotes, the mode of existence of a rule is as a generalization written in flesh and blood. And I wonder whether that was a sort of intentional pun written, because yeah, I was basically trying to work that out, because things that are written are then read, and traditionally, obviously, laws are written to be read, and they're very much what he'll go on to describe in terms of the manifest image, but also written and read has that kind of cybernetic meaning as well. So I was sort of wondering about how the reading side goes. So is it like the rules of proper, so he says at the end that these aren't rules that you can necessarily articulate, that there's something to what Wittgenstein was suggesting, that you just kind of know that the proper distance to stand apart from someone in this culture, it's this sort of space between me and them without me articulating it. So is that still going via kind of language and those kind of laws here for him, or is it almost like the other thing I was thinking is, it's probably too much, but I was wondering, is he actually suggesting that there's almost like an Althusserian kind of a layer on which all the rules are, but actually they're being sustained through certain physical material practices? Because what I found quite productive, again following our stream of thought about Sellars and Marxism, is his sort of inversion, which Marx also takes, of problematizing the universal for Hegel, and taking it from being something that's this ideal universal to concrete universal in human practice. I've kind of gone in too many directions probably, so I should probably stop rather than complicating things further. Okay.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. There's a lot there. And I guess the main thing I want to maybe think about, the main thing I like about that is the notion of, is that where you run back on, well, what do you mean by right? How, I mean, obviously, it's always a worry, sort of a problem to hang too much upon these metaphors. But there might be something to be thought about here, like written in, well, right, or inscribed, right? And I mean, I take it that he's picking up on written in, right? Because as a way to pick up on, well, rules have their primary mode of existence is as what people do, right? Rather than not there maybe have a secondary existence that's like, inscribed on paper, but a primary existence as it's behavioral, right? So rules are a particular kind of behavior, but it's what he says is kind of curious, and I've always sort of never quite understood what exactly.
It's backwards now, no? If we take Frege for his influence, then he's saying something quite un-Frege-like. if we take rule for universal statements of Frege and generalization for the concrete instances of the rules in Frege's thought, then in Frege's, the generalization is a disembodiment of a rule. Rule is not the embodiment of a generalization. Do you know what I mean? Because a rule is for all universal quantifiers if P then Q. For a generalization or a concrete instance, it is not the case that for all A's, it is either F or it is G. It is nor F nor G. Sorry, it's very to say it is very complicated. But if you see it on paper, it's very clear. So what Sellars is saying is very on Frege-like. Like that. That was exactly what the quote that baffled me as well, because I read it many times and I thought it's something wrong with it.
Oh, something wrong with the idea that a rule is an embodied generalization?
Yeah, that's the quote, I think.
Yeah. No, it's yeah, it certainly is. It's hard to know whether he's explicitly trying to attack Frege, but it certainly is. It certainly is un-Fregean, insofar as. But I think that he's very. I think he's very as much concerned with the ways in which a Fregean story is going to require a myth of the mental eye, or if you're going to sort of cash out what kind of psychology Fregean logic is going to demand, right? Because how is it that we are able to apprehend Bedeutung? Like, what is going on there? It's like, it's this kind of like, well, the third eye opens, you just see the Bedeutung. Like, that's not a story that any naturalist could possibly countenance. So I think he has to be anti-Fregean. Whether he's anti-Fregean in a particular passage is another question, but he has to be. And I think that there's a worry. I think that's very much, and I think, although the fact that he's picking up on he's non-Phrygian, but there's also inherits like this. You know, by the time he writes this, he has already read the blue and brown books, right? Wittgenstein has already made its way. Wittgenstein's work is already getting well known. So that there's a lot going on there. But yeah, I think he has to be non-Phrygian. I think he's very concerned with. He's very concerned with the idea that telling a kind of Phrygian story is going to require a kind of knowledge by acquaintance or ostensive tie. And I think he's going to be very concerned that that is not something that a pragmatic naturalist can accept. Okay, I think we have yeah, I think, well, we have two people who have raised hands. David,
sorry,
Vincent, did you see who was first, or is it Aaron or David? No,
I haven't, but anyone can go first.
I was second. Aaron can go first.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I want to just like focus still on this metaphor then, because there are two senses. So it comes up again on page 315 at the end of the piece, where he once again sort of does this thinking of rules in terms of the body, but instead of this time describing as written in flesh and blood, it's to describe rules, is to describe the skeletons of rules. A rule is lived, not described. Mm-hmm. What we justify is never a rule, but behavior and dispositions to behave. So I think there's some interesting resonance here, and then two ways that I can understand it, and I'll set those out. I guess I'll also, just to, at least to Kirill, but we had this discussion maybe like a year ago, right, Kirill? This exact discussion, and Brassier actually has a good talk on this with regard to chess. Mm-hmm. And the way in which when you play chess, you're not when you look at each piece cognitively in mind, bringing up, okay, this piece, like you relate the pieces to other pieces, and it's not, you don't see a pawn is that shape that can do, like you don't run through this. And I think, if I'm not wrong, the McDowell Dreyfus debate sort of runs through this similar kind of argument, right? About whether when you're to follow a rule means having the rule in mind, always bringing up, oh, when I use a verb next to an adverb, it like you're not always doing P to Q. Like what a rule is a context, I guess, at least for McDowell, of action, right?
Yeah.
And so there are two ways then to understand this metaphor and what Sellars is doing here, because he's both talking about this sort of from the manifest side, the irreducible context of a rule being lived, that the rule about chess pieces only makes sense if you have a social context in which you play chess. But on the other hand, he also wants to talk about habit, behavior, psychological association, in the sense in which you can really have like the ways in which these become lived, and you could describe them as psychological mechanisms, right? The same in the way that a dog salivates when you ring the bell. And so there's both sort of a written in flesh and blood in the way that a behaviorist would talk about, and then there's this irreducible pragmatist, sort of a rule as a lived context in which you can't just abstract to the concepts. It's being in a practical situation as a goal-directed agent who knows the rule in relation to what they want, right?
Yeah.
And you violate the rule and say, but you understand what I meant anyway. I know I mixed up my metaphor, but like, you know what I'm talking about. Where the goal is adequacy, right? Do you see, do you think he's trying to play both?
Well, I mean, I think that I wonder if Sellars might want to say that the behaviorist is right only because the pragmatist is right. Right. It's only because rules are embodied forms of human action that what the behaviorist does is even possible. But that is still going to live up. But that is going to live us still with the this fundamental tension. And then I think I appreciate attention to the end of the article, which you're left with lived versus described as a fundamental tension that we're left with. That the behaviorist, and I think this picks interesting ways about, like, not that Sellars addresses this at all ever, but I think it's interesting to notice this plays really interesting ways into how we're going to do any kind of philosophy of social science. Right, the anthropologist or sociologist, unlike the physicist, the anthropologist is describing the rules of the people that she studies. But she is describing the rules from a standpoint other than that of the people who are enacting that rule. And I think that raises, and this live describe thing might collapse in the case of the kind of hermeneutics involved in sociology, right? Where you are describing a rule that you yourself live by, but your descriptions of the rule then might change how you live it. So the lived described tension that we end with might collapse in some cases.
Can I just add one before we go to the next question? Yeah. So I wonder, I have an inkling that there's something else going on here, though, about the sort of way of linking up the two images, right? About the sort of, and it's sort of taking me back to a weird moment in philosophy and the scientific image of man about, I think someone mentioned before, the pink ice cubes, right? Where he says, this is the real problem that right? That we can't work in the sort of irreducibility of the pinkness of each H2O sort of molecule. Each H2O molecule is pink. Do you see a relation there between the sort of sensory process and behavioral sort of animal elements and the sort of linkage between that, or as a prerequisite for being an agent in this lived sense, right? It seems like he wants to draw that connection both ways, right? With his focus on behavior and habit.
Maybe, I'm not sure. I think those might be different issues. I think the worry about the pink ice cube is, what do you do with sensa when you have a purely functionalistic account of concepts? Right. What do you do, or what do you do with, like, there does seem to be, I think the word about sense is a worry about, okay, we can give a kind of, and maybe sort of advertising some things I'm worrying about myself, even if we could say use tools from cybernetics to give a functionalist account of concepts and thereby naturalize intentionality, there does seem to be a problem of sensory consciousness left over that can't be, as it were, cyberneticized. And that's where the sensa come in, as something that's posited in the scientific image for what can't be cyberneticized, given that we can tell a cybernetic story about concepts. Okay, I think we have David and then Dilshad.
I wanted to, I have a hard time understanding this part, this one part of the paper where he's talking about the hookup between rule-regulated symbol activity and the external environment relies on a meshing, like as some sort of interface between the rule-regulated activity and the tied behavior. So then he introduces like these things that function as the interface, like the sounds. I underlined the quote, sorry. Certain interorganic events must function as symbols in both senses, as both free and tied. Thus, as children, we learn to understand the noise blue in much the same way as the dog learns to understand the noise bone, but we leave the dog behind and the noise blue also comes to function for us in a system of rule-regulated activity. So I'm wondering, like, if we were to look at, say, like what contemporary kind of like neo-behaviorist animal researchers are doing, and they were to discover, like, here's something humans can do, like here's precisely where humans depart from animal learning, would this get us closer to the nature of this interface? Like, what is the human higher process that animal association learning can't do in behaviorism? But like, I'm thinking of something called relational frame theory, which is like a new, it's in the the guy who came up with it says, like, I broadly work in the pragmatist tradition. I broadly consider myself a Skinnerian, but I try and like take account of the cognitive revolution. And they think they found something about human cognition that doesn't show up in like when you're doing rat experiments that only humans could do. So I'm wondering if like maybe this could be something to look into in terms of like the higher processes, because he does talk about, at one point I think he says like I'm not going to deny that animal learning psychology is like if completed is like all there is. So there seems to be this he seems to be looking for this distinction between where do human agents exactly depart from, you know, animal agents. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I've never heard of relational frame theory, but I have the Wikipedia entry up right now, and I can take a look at it. I mean, but I do think this piece is an interesting question. Like, well, given, okay, so here's Sellars writing this text from 1948 or 1949, and what are we to make of it, given what we think might be ways of thinking about, the relationship between what makes human cognition different animal cognition. What are the differences that make a difference there? And certainly, this is a long time ago. This is before Chomsky. This is before the computational theory of mind was really the game in town that everyone had to be talking about. I mean, I guess and I often myself, I sort of wonder, just what does he? So one thing I probably would want to think about is what he exactly has in mind by certain intra-organic events. I mean, I guess he must have something in mind, like there's something going on, maybe not necessarily entirely in my brain, but maybe something happening within my body, right? Within the body-brain system. So there's something happening there that allows me to both reliably classify blue things as blue in ways similar to how cats or dogs, can reliably classify objects in their environment, but also be able to use those as counters use those as moves in the game of reason. So I can sort of say, well, does that look blue to you? No, it looks more purple to me. Are you sure? Well, you're not looking at the right kind of light, that kind of thing. I think Dilshad, I think you have a hand raised.
Yeah. I also had a question regarding the last, I think, the penultimate paragraph when it talks about, the ineffability of linguistic situation, regarding Wittgenstein. And I was wondering, he tries his best to, to reject the myth of the empirical given and the empiricist given and rationalist given. But at the same time, he assumes, I think he accepts some sort of Wittgensteinian philosophical quietism about another form of givenness, namely, the Wittgensteinian form of life. And Wittgenstein says, language is just there, like our lives. So I was wondering, could you call this a given, I don't know, some sort of meta given that Sellars seemed to succumb to, despite his rejection of empiricist and rationalist forms of givenness?
You mean like a givenism about forms of life?
Yeah. I remember you talked, in one of your papers, you talk about discursive given, I think. Is it referring to this kind of givenness?
Yeah.
Maybe linguistic framework when we assume that, there is no possibility of some sort of radical conceptual revision in terms of our linguistic framework. Maybe this is the discursive given that you talked about. I don't remember.
So this is a good worry to have, and I just think, I guess I maybe want to flag two different ways of thinking about this, because I think that, when you talk about the myth of the given, myth of the given is one of those phrases that everyone throws around. Everyone talks about it. I don't think there's very little consistency about what exactly it means. It's very easy to find people accusing each other of it. It's like psychologism, back in the days of the psychologism debates. Like everybody was accusing each other of being a psychologistic, but nobody actually was. Right? It's this sort of this constant excommunication. It's very you're not a real Sellarsian, but whatever. I sort of want to see what this remark is from so Cassia, I think you're exactly right. And I think one way of thinking about what makes the difference, right? One way of thinking about it would be to say, well, insofar as our ability to follow Carnap in conceptual engineering entirely new frameworks shows that we are not sort of stuck with these, the ones that we happen to have. So you can challenge, so you can say, well, it's not given because we can do conceptual engineering, whether a Carnapian variety or other kind of variety. Let me one way of thinking about it. Another approach would be to say, well, it's not given insofar as we can tell an evolutionary story about the processes that led to the formation of this sort of evolved conceptual scheme. I think we need both of those parts of the story. So I think Sellars is very, I forget where the text is. I could look it up, but I'm not going to bother right now. But like he has this sort of interesting moment, right, in his text where he says at one point that we're sort of moving from the evolved conceptual systems that we've been stuck with as well as evolution, and turning those into freely revisable conceptual schemes that we can alter and make and improve. So we have that sort of this both this.
I think he's talking about meaningful inference when he talks about self-correctiveness of language, of scientific language.
Yeah,
but,
I think inference and me think so.
Yeah, inference and meaning. But you know, I think
yes, that's the text I have in mind. Thank you.
You know, I think like Carnapian, the principle of tolerance is not the kind of activity that Sellars endorses, because there is some sort of normative conservatism within Sellars. He thinks there is a correct or ideal way of ideal rules or ideal, I don't know, normativity or ideal some sort of functional normativity. So I don't think you'd ascribe to the Carnapian principle of tolerance and conceptual engineering. There is some conservative element in Sellars, because he thinks of some sort of ideal correctness that that we try to make it explicit, for example.
Yeah, I guess I'm familiar with that worry. I think I know Reza has expressed that worry with me. I know he's very taken with Karas's take in the Carnap brought home volume, where Karas has an essay on Sellars and Carnap, and he sort of presses that worry. Maybe that's right. I don't know. I sort of, I mean, this is what things sort of makes them so. One of the things makes Sellars, I think, very attractive and interesting, but very difficult is like he has so many different influences that he's trying to hold together somehow, and just how well does that hold together? I mean, does he have a conception of ideal correctness? I mean, he has the conceptual scheme Persish as the regulative idea of inquiry. And that's not Carnapian. That's certainly true. Insofar as like he has that kind of Persian moment, that insofar as he has that kind of moment of ultimate convergence, and it's not just this endless proliferation in a kind of voluntaristic fashion that I think Carnap has. But is that, yeah, I guess I'm with you there. Okay? I don't think the end of inquiry is a considered moment. Okay, if no one else wants to chime in, then I think Cheyenne is next.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This isn't. This is all of everything that's been said is really great and thought-provoking and everything. This is sorry. I mean, I'll just be quick about it. I just wanted to ask you, Carl. Could we chat after this is finished? Would that be possible?
Yeah, I can give you some time.
Yeah, well, the thing is, because I know this is being recorded and it's going to be posted on the News Center, so I don't want to waste time on it now. But I was wondering if I could.
I understand your concern. That makes, of course.
Yeah, so I was going to ask if I could, like, I don't know, send you a link to my Zoom in the chat so we could have a private conversation afterwards.
Yeah, that'd be fine. Sure. You can either that or send it to my email at carl.sachs@gmail.com.
carl.sachs@gmail.com. Okay, yeah, and you should see the link there in just a minute. Thanks.
Okay.
That's all.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think. It's not inference and meaning. I was trying to think of its. It'll come to me, or I'll just sort of go back and do a lot of reading, and I'll find it. But it's sort of, I was just sort of trying to think about this moment in which just sort of think about this moment in Sellars' text where he talks about this contrast between the evolved conceptual schemes that we've been saddled with as a result of natural selection, and contrast that with the free invention of new conceptual schemes and the course of doing science and logic. But I think that you could, but in a way, both points would undermine the illusion of the given, but in different directions, right? Because on the one hand, there is no necessity to a conceptual scheme, or it's not the kind of necessity, the only kind of synthetic a priori that we're going to get from Sellars is synthetic a priori, relative to any conceptual scheme, right? So he has this kind of Michael Friedman kind of point that you're going to have the constitutive rules of any given conceptual scheme will tell you what kinds of permissible material inferences you can make. But there's no necessity to which conceptual scheme you've got to have, you have to use. It's a very strongly interesting, well, yeah, it's Carnapian, but more, but it's not, I was going to say, it's just not Kantian. So it's going to be attacked, but I think that it's important though for Sellars to try and make a lot of these Carnapian insights much more connected with naturalism, and much more connected than Carnap would be happy with whatever countenance. So I mean, if there's a conservative moment in Sellars, it might be this: that Sellars is unwilling, explicitly and I think on principle, to simply throw away metaphysics. I think that Sellars is very concerned with developing a scientific metaphysics, not with rejecting metaphysics in the name of science. So if there's a conservatism here, it's a kind of methodological conservatism about how to do philosophy. And for Sellars, that it's a methodological conservatism about the importance of preserving some kind of continuity with a philosophical project that begins with Plato and Aristotle, and not just throwing it all away in the way that Carnap wants to in his most sort of, burn the infamy kind of moments. Aaron, I think you have a hand again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just one. Can you cite the moment in the text you're talking about the way that no conceptual schema is, I guess, is necessary, or the sort of Hegelian point that you're making?
I'd have to find the exact passage for you. I mean, actually, he says it a couple of places. The one place that comes to mind off the top of my head is in some reflections on language games.
Mm-hmm.
Right, where he says, well, all we can really do is we'd have to have the evolving framework in response to novel behavioral adjustments, and there's nothing fixed or innate about that framework.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he says very similar things to that in the text, is there a synthetic a priori?
Mm-hmm. I guess the follow-up, is there more?
No, please.
Then would be, I guess, does it seem like then he's, especially here, kind of proposing that the role between, or the relationship between philosophy and psychology should be to kind of replace Kantian transcendent, like the conception of Kant as doing transcendental psychology with empirical psychology, or no, or is it more, yeah, would that kind of impede on the sort of freedom and autonomy of thought to revise and create new conceptual schemes? Sorry if that.
No, that's a good question. I'm thinking about this.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, Sellars is never too far from Kant, but his Kant is it's a weird Kant, right? It's sort of, I mean, as a reader of Kant, he's very interesting, but he has his own agenda that he reads into Kant. I mean, he does sort of say things even fairly late, where he's very talking about, trying to rehabilitate and defend transcendental psychology. So I guess one way of thinking about the question would be, how would we understand Sellers's, what turns out to be the relationship within Sellars between transcendental psychology and empirical psychology? And I think that's a really nice formulation of a question. Right now, I couldn't begin to give an answer. But I think it's a good question to have, and I think it's a question that's really going to be with us for the remainder of our seminar.
Yeah, because it seems like that's what, I guess, in putting these two sciences next to each other, yeah, what the relationship of them could be is sort of doing the work to see if there are sort of hardwired or evolved sort of behavioral habit mechanisms that enable us to then reach this other way of doing activity, of sort of a higher level or qualitatively different level of cognitive activity, where we can consider ourselves to be agents with purposes. How do we, what were these sort of evolved mechanisms that get us there, such that we could say those are necessary for anyone to be an agent? Or I guess the contrast would be the kind of Hegelian point that sort of someone like, I think Pippin makes, that Hegel's just like, yeah, I can make a conceptual scheme, watch me. Like, this is the logic, I'll just do it. Rather than needing to rely on this story of evolved psychological mechanisms that sort of create through emergence these other capacities. And I guess one example I can think of, it was a book that we kind of touched on in Daniel Sassolotto's class back in the fall by Joe Rouse. Are you familiar with Joseph Rouse?
Yeah, I'm familiar. I've read some of his books. Which one are you thinking about?
Which one? It's over here. It's from Articulating the World.
Oh yeah, no, I know that. I know that book quite well.
Well, yeah. Do you think he does a satisfactory job of that? He, at least in what I read of it, it's sort of, he understood himself as kind of giving an evolutionary story of how sort of intentionality is a unique feature of human cognition that evolves due to the kind of social behaviors that humans found necessary, but no animal ever would need to sort of evaluate their perceptual content, it would never need to relate to their perceptions as content and question or have the second order relation to them.
My only complaint with Joe's book is that his Heideggerianism forces him to be an interpretationalist about cognitive science. And I think that is, first of all, I think that there are many versions of representationalism in cog sci that are perfectly defensible. I think some of them have a good Sellarsian provenience. So like, I think that I think you probably do need a kind of representationalist story at some point in order to be able to talk about imagination or thinking in absence. You might need interpretation in order to be able to sort of tell a story about how organs can detect affordances. I have worries. I have a philosophical worry that ecological psychology is prone to a myth of the given of its own, insofar as affordances are just kind of magically just there for the organism. But then the alternative would have to be some kind of representationalism, and then you have to make sure that it can avoid other kinds of problems. But I only mentioned that only because that's my only complaint with Joe's book. Otherwise, I think that he's onto something really quite profound. And I think that, you know, the ways in which he talks about intentionality as sort of, in a way, interfering with animals meshing into their environments, right? And it's sort of, you know, I don't know how he puts it clearly in the book, but I know in conversations, he said things like, well, other animals don't need intentionality. It would get in the way of their doing what they do. They don't need it. It would be a problem, you know, they don't, you know, they can just satisfy their goals in a way that doesn't need it. So I think that there's a way in which, whether he realized it or not, Joe's distinction between sort of purposive responsiveness of animals and intentionality in humans, I think that really does, does the same work as Sellars' distinction in this text between tied behavior and free behavior.
Great, yeah, thanks. Oh, sorry, maybe I'll just follow up with one thing, because it seems like what was a little dissatisfying for me then, though I need to go back to the whole book and see how it plays out in his kind of sociological stuff about scientific practice, but the way in that it's kind of like flattening. It's just like what the sort of evolutionary description of the emergence of intentionality is just this sort of, okay, that's humanity's evolutionary niche, and that's sort of all that evolutionary psychology gives. It doesn't really change qualitatively. I feel like there's more promise in Sellars of how these how we relate, sort of more
maybe,
lower level mechanisms.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, intentionality for Rouse is central to the story about how we're able to invent science, how we're able to deliberately intervene in the world in these constructed artificial ways that reveal hidden causal regularities and untangle variables in ways that animals just can't. So like we are, I think, I don't know how much of a scientific realist Rouse would really want to be, but I think there's a story to be told in which, right, intentionality does allow us to really discern the causal texture of the world in a way that animals can't, because they're just responding to it. And while they're responding to it in ways that are clever and intelligent, sophisticated, you know, so we don't need to be reductionist about non-human animals, but they're not unpacking, they're not developing models that untangle the causal structure of reality, and we are. But I think Joe would happily accept that. So I don't think there's really much daylight between him and Sellars so far on that particular point. Okay, well, look, it's 2:34. I do need to talk with Shan a little bit, and then I have other things I need to do today besides talk about Sellars, even though I love doing that. So I think for next Saturday, our main text is Being and Being Known. I think I also recommend a short text from Wiener's the 6-page introduction to his text Cybernetics, which I recommend. There's also I also put online this very interesting article, Picturing, Attending, and Signifying by Bryce Huebner, which is a really an excellent article. I just recommend very highly. That sort of does a really interesting job of unpacking what Sellars means by picturing. And I recommend, I think it'd be an interesting approach for us to consider. So I think being known if is required, and the other two are recommended. Okay, and I guess in the meantime, between now and next Saturday, we just have the Discord channel, which I'll just check in on once in a while, just to see what people are talking about. And feel free to email me at any point if you wish. Okay.
Great.
Bye.